The unshaken faith of the Sullivan family amid injustice and fear is not merely a story of survival. It is the living pulse of conviction that beats against the rhythm of oppression. In 1834 Virginia, when the weight of society pressed down on those who dared to believe differently, faith was not a comfort, it was a battlefield. The Sullivan family understood this all too well. They were a modest household, bound by love, bound by Scripture, bound by an unyielding trust in a God who often seemed silent in the chaos. But silence never meant absence. Each dawn found the Sullivans gathering in their small wooden parlor, the scent of burning oak mingling with the soft murmur of prayer. Their Bible, worn and creased, carried the fingerprints of endurance. It wasn't just a book to them. It was their lifeline, their map through a world that often rejected their light. The town around them lived by rules of fear, by unspoken hierarchies that divided. Judged and punished, to be different was to be dangerous, and yet, in the midst of gossiping neighbors, in the glare of suspicious eyes, the Sullivans kept their faith alive. Not the kind of faith that folds under pressure, but the kind that grows teeth, the kind that refuses to bow when the world demands silence. Their prayers weren't gentle whispers of convenience. They were cries of defiance against despair. They prayed when crops failed. They prayed when threats came. They prayed when friends turned to strangers. And through it all, their faith did not break. It deepened, hardening into something immovable, something the world could not steal one evening, as thunder rolled across the valley and wind beat against the shutters. Thomas Sullivan, the patriarch of the family, gathered his children close. His voice trembled, not from fear, but from conviction. Faith, he said, isn't proven when it's easy, it's proven when everything says it's foolish. Those words sank deep into the hearts of his children, shaping the way they would face the world. They watched as their father stood tall even when accused falsely, as their mother wept but never wavered, as their home became both a refuge and a target. Faith, for them, wasn't a Sunday ritual, it was a daily act of courage. They believed when belief cost them friends, land, and safety. They believed because they had seen too much of God's mercy to turn back. The community's hostility grew like wildfire. Rumors painted them as radicals, traitors, dreamers chasing divine nonsense. Yet every time the world tried to shame them into silence, they chose to sing louder. Their hymns became both a comfort and a declaration. Neighbors could hear their voices rising in the night, a family daring to praise God while the world mocked their hope. That kind of faith wasn't born from comfort, it was forged in the fire of trial. It was the faith that refused to retreat, that turned fear into fuel and pain into purpose. When they lost their farm to unjust taxes, they didn't curse the heavens. They gathered in the empty field, joined hands, and prayed. When sickness swept through the town, they opened their doors to the afflicted, caring for others even when they themselves had little. Their faith was not selfish. It was sacrificial. There came a point when even the youngest of the Sullivan children began to understand that faith was not a shield against suffering, but a compass through it. They learned that God's promises were not a guarantee of ease, but a vow of presence. And in those quiet, fragile moments when hope felt like a dying ember, something unexplainable always stirred a peace that made no sense to the human mind. The Sullivans lived in that peace. They carried it like a secret flame, invisible yet undeniable. The world saw their struggles, their tears, their losses, but it could not comprehend their joy. Because joy for them was not the absence of hardship, it was the defiance of it. Every challenge became a sermon without words. Every act of love a testimony that faith still stands even when the earth shakes. And though history may have forgotten their names, heaven remembers every prayer whispered in that small Virginia home in 1834. The power of legacy, how one family's choices shaped generations, echoes far beyond the boundaries of time. The Sullivan family may have lived in 1834 Virginia, but their influence stretched into the unseen corridors of the future. Legacy to them was not about wealth, land, or status. It was about the kind of truth that could be passed from heart to heart. In a time when names were often forgotten and graves unmarked, the Sullivans built something that no storm could erase. Their legacy began in the small, daily acts of faith that seemed insignificant to the world but eternal to God. Each decision they made, every stand they took, was a seed sown in soil richer than they could imagine. They lived with an awareness that their lives were not their own, that the choices they made would either curse or bless those yet unborn Thomas and Margaret Sullivan, the parents at the core of this story, understood the sacred weight of example. They knew that what their children saw in them would one day live through them. So, when injustice struck, they did not respond with bitterness, they responded with grace. When hatred confronted them, they returned love, not weakness, but deliberate, defiant love. Those watching could not understand it. Their children, however, absorbed it. They learned that strength wasn't measured by how loudly you fought, but by how faithfully you stood. In their household, forgiveness was not an emotion, it was a decision. Generosity was not an option, it was a command. Their children grew up in an atmosphere where truth was treasured more than safety, where character meant more than comfort. That atmosphere shaped everything that came after. When Thomas gathered his sons and daughters around the fire each evening, he did not speak of riches or fame. He spoke of responsibility. What we do, he told them, will echo in their hearts long after our voices are gone. The children didn't fully grasp it then, but they would. Years later, when each one faced trials of their own, they would remember the courage of their father's eyes, the calm of their mother's prayers, the steadfast peace that filled their home when the world outside was cruel. That memory became their compass, guiding them through storms they never expected. The Sullivan legacy wasn't about being remembered, it was about living in such a way that others would be redeemed. It was about making choices that honored God even when no one else saw. Because unseen obedience builds eternal foundations, the world around them valued strength of arm, power of wealth, and pride of name, but the Sullivans chose a different inheritance. They left their children the gift of conviction, the courage to stand when others bowed. That courage took root in the family line like a mighty oak. Generations later, a descendant facing war would refuse to abandon his faith. Another, fighting poverty, would become a light of compassion in her community. Each one, knowingly or not, was walking in the footsteps of that 1,834 family who refused to bend under the weight of fear. Their story became a silent inheritance, passed through blood and spirit. It taught that legacy is not carved in stone monuments. It is carved in the decisions we make, when no one is watching. Even the land they once tilled held memory. Long after their home had crumbled, people said the field still felt sacred, that something in the soil remembered the prayers once spoken there. And maybe it did. Maybe legacy is more spiritual than we realize. It lives in the echoes of kindness, in the endurance of love, in the faith that continues when names are forgotten. The Sullivans did not set out to be remembered, they set out to be faithful. Their faith became a bridge across generations, connecting those who came after to a truth that does not age. They proved that one family's quiet obedience could alter the course of many lives. What they built with courage and conviction in that humble Virginia home would ripple through time, reminding every generation that the power of legacy lies not in what we leave behind, but in who we raise up to carry the light forward. The divine strength found in standing firm when silence seemed safer was the heartbeat of the Sullivan family story. In 1834 Virginia, silence was often the rule of survival. People learned to bow their heads, to speak softly, to look away from injustice for the sake of peace. But peace built on fear is not peace, it is surrender. The Sullivans understood this painful truth. They lived in a time when speaking out could bring ruin, when doing what was right could cost everything. Yet in that tension between safety and conviction, they found divine strength, a strength that was not born of their own will, but poured into them by the God they refused to deny. Every test they faced became an altar where faith was proven genuine. Their courage was not loud or boastful. It was steady, quiet, and deeply rooted in a trust that could not be shaken by threats or loss. There came a day when Thomas Sullivan was summoned before local authorities, accused of spreading ideas that challenged the comfortable order of the town. He stood there, surrounded by men whose faces bore the smugness of power, and was told to recant, to stop gathering people for prayer, to stop preaching hope to those the world had forgotten. Every word against him was a temptation to retreat into silence, to protect his family by yielding. But something inside him would not bow. He looked his accusers in the eye, not with anger, but with unflinching conviction, and simply said, "Truth does not yield to fear." That sentence became a banner over his family. His children never forgot it. They saw their father choose faith over safety, and they learned that courage is not the absence of fear. It is the decision to stand firm even when fear has every right to exist. Margaret, his wife, carried her own kind of strength, the kind that rarely made headlines but changed the course of hearts. When whispers spread through the community, when doors closed and friends turned away, she stood in her doorway and prayed. Her prayers were not desperate cries for rescue. They were declarations that God was still sovereign, even when the world was cruel. There were nights when she heard the sound of footsteps outside, threats meant to intimidate them, and she would light a candle and let it burn through the darkness as a symbol that their faith was still alive. That simple act of defiance became a sermon of its own. Her quiet endurance reminded her children that standing firm was not always about shouting truth from rooftops. It was about refusing to let the darkness extinguish your flame. The Sullivan children grew up watching this faith lived out, not preached. They saw what it meant to hold convictions that cost something. When they were mocked or ridiculed at school, they remembered their parents' steadiness. They learned that divine strength is not inherited through words, but through example. That strength became their armor in a world that often demanded compromise. They discovered that there is a sacred power in simply refusing to give in. And though they were young, their spirits grew strong. They carried an understanding that every act of courage, no matter how small, adds weight to eternity. When they prayed, they didn't ask for ease, they asked for endurance. As years passed, the story of the Sullivan family became a quiet legend, whispered among those who knew them. People who once criticized them began to admire their consistency. Some who had mocked them found themselves drawn to the same faith they once rejected. That is the mysterious way divine strength works. It doesn't always change the circumstances, but it changes the hearts watching from afar. The Sullivans' strength was not a product of pride but of surrender. They didn't stand firm because they were fearless. They stood firm because they trusted a God greater than fear. In every hardship, in every loss, they found that divine strength flowed most powerfully when their own strength was gone. And in a time when silence seemed safer, they proved that standing firm was not only an act of resistance but an act of worship, a declaration that truth, no matter how costly, is always worth standing for.